The most technologically advanced special operations force in human history trains its operators to depend on machines. The British SAS trains its operators to assume every machine will fail. In the Scottish Highlands in 1987, both philosophies met the same mountain. Only one walked off it. Those men aren't human. The words came from a Delta Force lieutenant colonel in a classified after-action report dated November 1987. He wasn't being poetic. He was explaining why his unit had failed a joint exercise that the British operators completed without pause. This is the story of why a £78 million annual budget consistently outperforms $1.2 billion, and why the most advanced military on Earth quietly sends its elite to learn from an island that lost an empire. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, August 1987. A Delta Force officer, rank of major, 7 years in special operations, sat in a classified briefing room watching grainy VHS footage of SAS selection. Men stumbling through Welsh mountains in driving rain. Bergens that looked absurdly oversized. No helicopters, no vehicles, no support infrastructure visible anywhere. He laughed. "These guys are still fighting the Falklands," he reportedly said. A colleague who witnessed the moment would later recall the exact words, because 3 months later, that same major would radio for emergency extraction from a Scottish mountainside, while the British operators he'd dismissed continued their mission without him. The exercise was called Highland Forge, Joint UK-US Special Operations Training designed to test interoperability under degraded conditions. Degraded meant no GPS. The satellites were intentionally blocked. Degraded meant no air support. The weather window was chosen specifically for its impossibility. Degraded meant 72 hours of continuous movement through terrain that had killed experienced mountaineers in summer, let alone November. The American contingent brought cutting-edge thermal imaging. They brought encrypted burst transmitters. They carried lightweight composite frame rucksacks designed by aerospace engineers. Their loadout represented $340, $000 per operator in 1987 dollars. The SAS brought what they always brought: Bergen rucksacks unchanged since the 1970s, silver compasses, ordnance survey maps in waterproof cases, chocolate, tea. At the 47-hour mark, the Major's thermal optics had condensation damage. His burst transmitter couldn't find a satellite. His ultralight rucksack frame had cracked at a weld point. He was hypothermic, his navigation uncertain, his position approximately 4 kilometers off his planned route. The 2 SAS sergeants who had been paralleling his team were exactly where they intended to be. They had covered 11 more kilometers than the Americans in the same time window, carrying heavier loads, using equipment their grandfathers would have recognized. When the Major was extracted by emergency helicopter, weather having cleared just enough, the SAS men didn't stop. They completed the full exercise, arriving at the final checkpoint 6 hours ahead of schedule. The question wasn't whether American technology had failed. The question was whether it had ever been the advantage they assumed. The divergence began in 1977. That year, the United States formally established Delta Force under Colonel Charles Beckwith, himself an exchange officer who had served with the SAS in Malaya and Rhodesia. Beckwith understood what made the British model work. What he built, however, reflected American strategic culture, not British operational philosophy. Delta received virtually unlimited funding. By 1985, the unit's annual equipment budget exceeded the entire operating cost of 22 SAS regiment by a factor of 8. American operators trained with prototype weapons systems. They had access to satellite intelligence that most NATO generals couldn't request. They flew on helicopters modified specifically for their missions, maintained by crews who existed solely to serve their needs. The SAS, meanwhile, operated on what one former Hereford instructor called the budget of a medium-sized grammar school. Equipment requests were denied routinely. New weapons systems arrived years after American counterparts had them. Training facilities were adequate rather than exceptional, but the training hours told a different story. Delta operators in 1987 spent approximately 340 hours annually on weapons proficiency, 180 hours on tactical communications, 95 hours on vehicle operations, and 120 hours on physical conditioning, the remainder devoted to mission-specific technical training. SAS operators in the same period logged 290 hours on weapons, 85 hours on communications, 60 hours on vehicles, and 580 hours on what the regiment simply called soldiering, navigation without instruments, load-bearing over distance, decision-making under physiological stress, survival when every system fails. The American model assumed technology would function, training optimized for that assumption, creating operators who performed magnificently when their equipment worked and adequately when it didn't. The British model assumed technology would fail at the worst possible moment and trained accordingly, producing operators who performed adequately with functioning equipment and magnificently without it. These weren't competing philosophies. They were competing answers to a fundamental question. What is the irreducible core of a special operations soldier? The Americans answered, a platform for technology delivery. The British answered, a human being who remains effective when everything else is gone. Highland Forge had tested both answers against the same mountain. The mountain rendered its verdict without ambiguity. To understand why those SAS sergeants didn't stop, you must understand what it took to become them. SAS selection, officially titled United Kingdom Special Forces Selection, begins with a number, 55 pounds. That is the minimum weight of the Bergen rucksack before water and mission-specific equipment. With water, food, and weapon, the load approaches 70 pounds. With additional stores for extended patrol, 80 pounds is common. Operators have completed selection phases carrying 95 pounds across the Brecon beacons. The beacons themselves are not mountains by alpine standards. Penny Fan rises to only 886 meters. But these hills are uniquely cruel, steep approaches with no switchbacks, ground that shifts between ankle-breaking rock and boot-sucking bog, weather that changes from clear to zero visibility in minutes rather than hours. The selection course covers approximately 260 kilometers over 3 weeks, though the actual distance walked is significantly higher due to intentional navigation problems and route adjustments. Candidates must complete timed point-to-point marches solo, carrying full weight, navigating by map and compass alone, with no knowledge of total distance or time requirements. The final march is called Endurance, 40 miles across the highest terrain in the beacons, 20 hours or less, carrying everything. Alone. Since 1960, the pass rate has averaged 8.7%. In some years, 1979, 1984, 1991, it dropped below 5%. The regiment has never adjusted standards to meet recruitment needs, preferring to deploy understrength rather than undertrained. 23 men have died during or immediately after selection, most from exposure or exhaustion-related cardiac events. The course continues to run in conditions that have killed candidates before, because those conditions are precisely what the regiment needs to identify. Men who function when the body demands they stop. The American officer who laughed at the VHS footage had completed Delta selection, a genuinely difficult course involving similar physical demands. But Delta selection lasts 17 days. SAS selection runs 6 months, including jungle and resistance to interrogation phases that break men who survived the hills. The men who emerge aren't tougher. They've been filtered until only a particular type of human remains, one who treats suffering as atmospheric. It was at this moment that Highland Forge revealed its true purpose. The exercise planners, a joint committee of JSOC and UK Special Forces Directorate staff, had designed the scenario specifically to stress American technological dependencies. This wasn't malice. It was necessary testing before potential real-world joint operations. If the alliance couldn't function when equipment failed, better to learn in Scotland than in Soviet-occupied territory. The first 12 hours proceeded normally. American thermal imaging proved superior for night movement. Encrypted communications allowed real-time coordination that impressed the British liaison observers. The Delta contingent moved efficiently, their technological integration genuinely impressive. Then the satellite window closed. The exercise coordinators had arranged for jamming that simulated Soviet electronic warfare capabilities. GPS signals disappeared. Burst transmitters couldn't handshake with overhead assets. Thermal optics, designed for desert environments, struggled with the moisture saturation of Scottish air. The American teams had backup procedures. They weren't incompetent. But their backup procedures assumed degraded technology, not absent technology. They could function with intermittent GPS. Complete GPS denial required map and compass navigation skills that existed in their training manuals but not in their operational habits. The SAS teams barely noticed. They had been navigating by map and compass from the exercise start, treating their own GPS units as curiosities rather than dependencies. When the jamming began, their pace didn't change. Their route accuracy didn't change. Their operational rhythm, honed through those 580 annual hours of soldiering, continued as if technology had never existed. By hour 30, the divergence was measurable. By hour 47, it was catastrophic. The Delta Major who requested extraction wasn't weak. His fitness scores exceeded most of the SAS operators on the exercise. He was disoriented because his navigation skills had atrophied under the assumption that technology would compensate, and he was hypothermic because his team had slowed to verify position repeatedly, losing the heat-generating momentum that continuous movement provides. His equipment had cost more than most British soldiers would earn in a decade. In the Scottish Highlands, with the satellites blocked and the weather closed in, it became weight he couldn't justify. There is a philosophy embedded in how a soldier packs his rucksack. The American approach, codified in the 1980s, emphasized optimal load distribution, spreading weight across the body using engineered frame systems that transferred pressure to the hips and reduced spinal compression. The goal was maintaining peak physical performance as long as possible. When performance degraded, external support, vehicles, helicopters, resupply, would compensate. The British approach, largely unchanged since Malaya, emphasized tolerable degradation. The Bergen sits higher on the back, creating a less efficient center of gravity, but allowing the operator to remain mobile even when injured, exhausted, or moving through terrain that would destroy an optimized frame. The goal was functioning at 60% capacity indefinitely, rather than 95% capacity until systems failed. You don't train for the good day, a former SAS instructor explained in a 2003 interview. You train for the day when you've been awake for 90 hours and your hip is dislocated and you still have 18 kilometers to cover before dawn. American training gets you ready for Tuesday. Our training gets you ready for the moment you realize you might not survive. The difference manifested in rucksack selection itself. Delta operators carried frames engineered to specific body measurements, comfortable when intact, but difficult to repair in the field. SAS operators carried Bergens that could be patched with boot leather and paracord, uncomfortable by design because comfort creates dependency. This philosophy extended beyond equipment into doctrine. American mission planning assumed communication with command structures throughout operations, creating single points of failure that became apparent when Highland Forge eliminated those structures. British mission planning assumed communication would fail, requiring operators to internalize command intent deeply enough to function autonomously for days. The Delta Major who requested extraction had been trained to integrate with systems. The SAS sergeants who continued had been trained to replace them. When the exercise ended, the after-action review produced the classified report containing those 4 words that would later leak. Those men aren't human. But what the SAS had proven was precisely the opposite. They were irreducibly, stubbornly human in ways technology had quietly eroded. January 22, 1991. Western Iraq. 8 men inserted by helicopter into terrain that intelligence reports described as flat and uninhabited. The reports were wrong. Within 48 hours of landing, Bravo 20 found themselves surrounded by an Iraqi armored division that wasn't supposed to exist in their operational area. Sergeant Andy McNabb led the patrol alongside Chris Ryan, whose solo escape would later become the longest successful evasion in SAS history. They carried equipment for 14 days. They had communications that failed within hours of insertion, and they faced a choice that no amount of satellite coverage could make for them. The mission parameters had seemed achievable on paper. Locate and destroy mobile Scud missile launchers threatening Israel, report Iraqi troop movements, remain undetected for 2 weeks. What the briefings failed to mention was that the uninhabited desert contained Bedouin encampments, military installations, and a civilian population that would compromise their position faster than any electronic surveillance could have predicted. When a young goat herd stumbled upon their hiding position, everything collapsed. The patrol split during the ensuing firefight. 3 men would die. 4 would be captured and tortured. Only one, Chris Ryan, would reach Syria on foot. The distance Ryan covered exceeded 300 kilometers. He walked for 7 nights through temperatures that dropped below -15 Celsius, without food for the final 4 days, suffering from hypothermia so severe that his rescuers initially believed he was delirious beyond recovery. His equipment failed systematically. Radio batteries died, GPS units froze, even his water bottles cracked in the cold. What didn't fail was the training that had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Every technique he employed, navigation by stars, water discipline, movement patterns designed to conserve body heat, came directly from SAS selection's most brutal phases. The Delta officer who would later study this mission asked a question that revealed more than he intended. How did Ryan know what to do when nothing worked? The answer would take him years to understand. During the Gulf War, American intelligence operated the most sophisticated orbital surveillance network ever deployed. KH-11, Kennan satellites provided imagery resolution of approximately 6 inches, enough to read license plates, identify vehicle types, count individual soldiers in formation. None of this prevented Bravo 20's compromise. The fundamental problem wasn't resolution, it was latency. Satellite passes over western Iraq occurred at predictable intervals, with imagery requiring between 18 and 72 hours to reach ground commanders after processing, analysis, and distribution through military channels. By the time a photograph showed Iraqi troop movements, those troops had already repositioned twice. American commanders trusted this system because they had built it. The billions invested in orbital assets created institutional faith that no human reconnaissance could match technological precision. Yet precision without timeliness produced something worse than ignorance. It produced false confidence, the belief that the operational picture was accurate when it was actually showing yesterday's battlefield. SAS doctrine approached intelligence differently. Their patrol reports emphasized what satellite imagery could never capture: local population density, civilian movement patterns, the sound of vehicle engines at night, the smell of cooking fires that indicated encampments beyond visual range. Human sensors processed this information in real time, adapting to conditions that changed hourly rather than daily. The bureaucratic delays compounded the technical limitations. Intelligence assessments required sign-off from multiple command levels before reaching operators. Requests for updated imagery entered queues alongside thousands of other priorities. The system optimized for comprehensive coverage rather than tactical responsiveness, serving strategic planners while leaving ground teams functionally blind. When Bravo 20 requested updated intelligence on their insertion area, the response took 4 days to process. By then, the patrol was already compromised and fighting for survival across terrain that headquarters still believed was empty. A classified review conducted after the war identified 17 instances where satellite intelligence contradicted ground truth reports from SAS patrols. In 16 cases, the patrols were correct, and the satellites showed conditions that no longer existed. Technology had not failed. Faith in technology had failed. The Delta officer returned from his British exchange with 47 pages of observations. His original after-action assessment contained language that would never survive the Pentagon's review process. He had written that SAS selection produced a fundamentally different category of operator than American Tier 1 programs. He documented training scenarios where British candidates completed objectives after deliberate equipment sabotage, radios destroyed, maps confiscated, vehicles disabled, and noted that Delta's equivalent exercises always maintained some technological baseline. His commanding officer asked him to reconsider the comparative framing. What the original report contained, according to sources who reviewed it before revision, was an extended analysis of institutional philosophy. The officer had observed that American special operations culture treated technology as force multiplication. The more advanced the equipment, the more capable the operator. British culture treated technology as borrowed time, useful when functioning, irrelevant when conditions deteriorated. The distinction mattered because it shaped training priorities. Delta invested heavily in technical proficiency, encrypted communications, advanced optics, precision navigation systems. SAS invested in what one instructor called the space between equipment failures, the hours or days when operators would function with nothing but physical conditioning and mental discipline. The revised report softened these observations into bureaucratically acceptable language. Different approaches suited to different operational contexts. Complementary capabilities within NATO framework. The kind of diplomatic phrasing that allowed everyone to feel validated while communicating nothing. But the officer kept his original notes. Years later, after retirement, he shared portions with researchers studying Joint Special Operations doctrine. His unfiltered assessment remained consistent. I watched men complete exercises that would have required our teams to request extraction. They didn't seem to notice the difference in difficulty. That's when I understood we were measuring capability incorrectly. The Pentagon briefings that followed his exchange emphasized interoperability and shared standards. His actual conclusions, that British methodology produced superior baseline human capability, never reached the decision-makers who allocated training resources. Some truths proved too uncomfortable for official channels. SAS selection does not exist to identify the strongest candidates. Strength fails predictably under sustained stress. Selection exists to find men who continue functioning after strength is exhausted, after the body has signaled surrender, and the mind has begun negotiating with pain. The training philosophy emerged from operational necessity. During World War II, SAS patrols operated behind enemy lines for weeks without resupply, in environments where extraction meant death and survival required adaptation. Founder David Sterling recognized that conventional military training produced soldiers dependent on institutional support structures. His unit needed operators who became their own support structure. This principle crystallized into selection scenarios designed around systematic deprivation. Candidates navigate unfamiliar terrain carrying crushing loads, while instructors progressively remove advantages. Maps become deliberately inaccurate. Compass bearings lead to wrong checkpoints. Radio contact disappears without explanation. The exercise called Long Drag covers 40 miles across the Brecon beacons in 20 hours, carrying a 55-pound Bergen Plus weapon and water. Candidates who complete the distance within time limits have merely qualified for the next phase, where instructors introduce complications that make the previous suffering seem manageable. But the critical element isn't physical endurance, it's psychological calibration. Candidates must complete objectives while accepting that the rules will change without warning, that promised support will evaporate, that the mission parameters presented at briefing bear little resemblance to operational reality. This training creates operators who treat equipment failure as an expected variable rather than a crisis. When Chris Ryan's GPS died in the Iraqi desert, his response wasn't panic, it was navigation by stellar observation, a skill practiced until it required no conscious thought. When his radio batteries froze, he didn't attempt repair. He accepted the silence and continued moving. The Delta officer who studied this system asked why American selection didn't incorporate similar deprivation scenarios. His British counterpart's answer stayed with him for decades. Because your doctrine assumes technology will function. Ours assumes it won't. One assumption had been tested repeatedly in combat. The other remained theoretical. The Iraqi desert in January 1991 reached daytime temperatures near 15 degrees Celsius, mild enough for comfortable movement, warm enough to suggest that cold weather preparation was unnecessary. The briefings were wrong about this too. When darkness fell, temperatures plummeted to -15 Celsius. The 40-degree daily swing created conditions that no standard military equipment was designed to survive, and the Bravo 20 patrol discovered this through systematic failure of every technological advantage they carried. Radio batteries died first. Lithium-ion cells lose approximately 40% of their capacity at freezing temperatures and become essentially non-functional below -10. The patrol's primary communication equipment lasted less than 24 hours in operational conditions, leaving 8 men without contact to headquarters in hostile territory. GPS units followed. The early 1991 receivers required substantial battery power and generated minimal internal heat. Once ambient temperatures dropped below their operating threshold, screens dimmed, signals lost lock, and navigation reverted to methods unchanged since ancient mariners watched the stars. Water froze in canteens, weapon lubricants thickened until actions became sluggish. The cold crept into everything, turning advanced military technology into dead weight that still had to be carried across hostile terrain. But the most dangerous failure was physiological, not mechanical. Human bodies lose heat faster than they can generate it when ambient temperatures drop below certain thresholds. The patrol members burned calories at rates their rations couldn't sustain, entering caloric deficits that compounded with each passing hour. Decision-making degraded alongside core temperature, a cognitive decline that made every choice slightly worse than the one before. Chris Ryan's survival depended on recognizing this cascade early enough to compensate. He abandoned equipment that no longer functioned, conserved energy through calculated movement, and accepted that his body was now his only reliable tool. The technology that was supposed to provide decisive advantage had become liability. The training that stripped away technological dependence had become the difference between life and death. In the frozen darkness of the Iraqi desert, only one doctrine was validated. The classified after-action reports from joint exercises between 1987 and 1994 told a story that never reached congressional testimony or defense appropriations hearings. Documents later declassified under Freedom of Information requests contained assessments that would have embarrassed procurement committees across Washington. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, and devastating. British SAS elements consistently achieved mission objectives at rates 23 to 31% higher than American counterparts when electronic warfare simulation degraded communications and navigation capabilities. That sentence appeared in a 1991 Joint Special Operations Command internal review. It was never cited in any public forum. Senior American operators spoke more candidly in retirement. A former Delta Squadron commander, interviewed for an oral history project at Fort Bragg in 2003, described watching SAS teams during a combined exercise in the Scottish Highlands. "We had better gear, better support, better everything on paper. They had knowledge that couldn't be purchased." The gap wasn't about individual talent. American operators matched or exceeded British counterparts in marksmanship, physical conditioning, and technical proficiency under optimal conditions. The divergence emerged exclusively when conditions ceased to be optimal, when batteries died, when satellites went silent, when extraction windows closed. Defense contractors understood this vulnerability, but possessed no financial incentive to address it. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon sold systems, not doctrine. Congressional appropriations funded equipment, not suffering. The entire procurement ecosystem rewarded technological solutions to human problems. A retired British exchange officer who served with JSOC from 1992 to 1995 recalled a conversation with an American general who had reviewed the joint exercise data. He said the numbers were clear. He said his hands were tied. He said the system couldn't reward what couldn't be photographed or itemized on a budget line. The knowledge existed. The institutional will to act on it did not. So the reports were filed, the exercises continued, and the gap between what American leadership knew privately and what shaped American doctrine publicly grew wider with each passing year. To understand why British operators performed differently, you must trace their doctrine backward through 50 years of imperial collapse. The SAS that humbled Delta Force in 1991 was not an organization that had emerged from victory. It was forged in the long retreat from empire, in small wars fought with insufficient resources against enemies who knew the terrain intimately. Malaya, 1950 to 1960. The SAS hunted communist insurgents through jungle so dense that helicopters couldn't extract casualties. Patrols lasted weeks. Resupply was irregular. Operators learned to survive on what they carried and what they found, because the alternative was death in vegetation that would swallow their bodies without trace. Oman, 1970 to 1976. The Dhofar Rebellion forced SAS teams into mountain warfare against Marxist guerrillas supplied by South Yemen and the Soviet Union. Temperatures exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. Water was measured in sips. The campaign lasted 6 years and produced a generation of sergeants who understood that hardship was not an aberration, but the baseline condition of their profession. The Falklands, 1982. SAS reconnaissance teams inserted by helicopter onto South Atlantic islands 8,000 miles from home support, in conditions so brutal that several operators developed trench foot within 48 hours. They observed Argentine positions for days without relief, transmitting intelligence that shaped the entire British campaign, while experiencing cold that American planners would have deemed unacceptable for extended operations. Each of these conflicts taught the same lesson. The empire was ending, resources would always be inadequate, and the only reliable asset was the operator himself. This institutional memory passed through the regiment not as written doctrine, but as oral tradition, transmitted from instructors to candidates during selection, from senior NCOs to junior troopers during training exercises. The suffering was the curriculum, inherited across generations like a family trade. By 1991, this accumulated wisdom had crystallized into an organizational culture that expected deprivation and trained specifically for its psychological management. British operators didn't overcome hardship through superior willpower. They simply failed to register it as surprising. The evidence was unambiguous. The lessons were available. And yet, in the 3 decades following Desert Storm, American special operations doctrine evolved in precisely the opposite direction from what British experience suggested. The reasons were structural, not intellectual. Consider the career incentives facing a Delta Force officer in 1993. Promotion boards rewarded officers who managed complex acquisitions programs, who integrated new technologies, who demonstrated mastery of systems that could be briefed to congressional committees. An officer who advocated for reduced equipment dependence, for training that emphasized primitive navigation, for doctrine that assumed technological failure. That officer was advocating for his own irrelevance within the procurement ecosystem. Defense contractors understood this dynamic perfectly. Raytheon employed former special operations officers as consultants specifically to ensure that new systems addressed problems the community would recognize. The revolving door between military command and defense industry created feedback loops that reinforced technological solutions regardless of evidence suggesting their limitations. Congressional appropriations committees rewarded programs with clear deliverables. A satellite communication system could be photographed, demonstrated, and itemized on a budget spreadsheet. An operator's ability to function without that system existed in no category that appropriations law recognized. The British model offered no purchase points for this machinery. You could not contract suffering. You could not appropriate hardship. The qualities that made SAS operators effective in degraded conditions were products of selection and training regimes that resisted quantification and therefore resisted funding justification. A retired American general, speaking at a special operations conference in 2008, acknowledged the paradox directly. We know what works. We cannot build institutions that produce it. So we build institutions that produce what we can measure, and hope the gap doesn't kill too many of our people. The gap did kill people. In Mogadishu, in Afghanistan, in circumstances where technological superiority evaporated and operators found themselves in exactly the primitive conditions British training had always assumed. But the procurement machinery continued. Because machinery, unlike wisdom, has shareholders. The psychological divergence began before any operator reached their unit. It began in selection, in the deliberate construction of identity through controlled destruction. British SAS selection was designed to break candidates mentally before it ever tested them physically. The uncertainty was engineered. Routes changed without warning. Timelines collapsed. Instructors offered no encouragement and no feedback. Candidates learned that suffering was information without content, that hardship communicated nothing about their proximity to success or failure, that the only relevant data was whether they could continue. This produced operators who expected conditions to be worse than briefed. They planned for equipment failure because planning otherwise seemed naive. When technology functioned, they treated it as temporary good fortune rather than operational baseline. American selection processes, while physically demanding, operated within more defined parameters. Delta's operator training course was brutal, but followed recognizable progressions. Candidates understood the evaluation metrics. The uncertainty, while present, was bounded by institutional transparency that British doctrine specifically avoided. The resulting psychological profiles diverged in subtle but consequential ways. American operators optimized for conditions they could anticipate, developing extraordinary competence within expected parameters. When those parameters shifted, when communications failed, when navigation systems went dark, when extraction windows closed, the cognitive adjustment required was larger precisely because the training had not systematically prepared for it. A British psychologist who consulted for both nations' special operations communities from 1995 to 2010 described the difference in terms of baseline expectations. American operators expected excellence and trained to deliver it. British operators expected catastrophe and trained to function within it. Both approaches produced remarkable soldiers. Only one approach produced soldiers who remained remarkable when everything failed. This was not a criticism of American character. The divergence reflected institutional choices, not national deficiencies. American special operations could have adopted British approaches at any point. The decision not to was deliberate, driven by the structural factors that made technological dependence institutionally rational, even when operationally dangerous. Character is not born. It is constructed through choices made by organizations long before any individual operator reports for duty. The Delta Force officer, who allegedly spoke those words in February 1991, had spent 15 years in American special operations by that point. He had completed selection processes that eliminated 90% of applicants, survived training that most professional soldiers considered impossible, and deployed to environments that remained classified decades later. He was not easily impressed. He was not prone to hyperbole. And yet, watching British operators function in conditions that had degraded his own team's effectiveness, He reached for language that transcended professional assessment. Those men aren't human. Years later, according to accounts from colleagues who served with him, the officer refined this observation into something more precise. The British operators were not superhuman. They were differently human, shaped by institutions that had optimized for circumstances American doctrine treated as edge cases. "We train to win," he reportedly said during a lecture at Fort Bragg in 2004. "They train to survive losing. When everything works, we're better. When nothing works, they're still there." This distinction illuminates something fundamental about elite performance. Technology extends human capability, but extension creates dependency, and dependency creates fragility. The most advanced operator equipped with the most sophisticated systems remains vulnerable to the failure of those systems in ways that a less equipped operator, trained specifically for deprivation, simply does not experience. The future of warfare will test this distinction repeatedly. Adversaries with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities will target exactly the systems American doctrine treats as essential. Satellite navigation will fail. Communications will be jammed. The operators who remain effective in these conditions will be those whose training prepared them to expect nothing and function anyway. The Delta officer's original assessment was not an insult. It was recognition, perhaps reluctant, perhaps painful, that human beings could be shaped by institutions to exceed what technology-dependent training produced. That excellence had forms American doctrine had not prioritized. Those men aren't human, but perhaps they represented something more human than the alternatives. Human capability stripped of technological crutches, human resilience forged through deliberate hardship, human performance that required nothing but the human. The officers who trained them are mostly retired now. The operations they conducted remain partially classified. But the lesson persists, waiting in archived after-action reports and the memories of American operators who watched men function in conditions that should have been impossible. If this examination of what separates elite human performance from elite equipped performance resonated with you, consider subscribing for more investigations into military history that official narratives prefer to simplify. The next video explores another chapter the documentaries skip entirely. We'll see you there.